Welcome back to another episode of Law Schoolers. In this episode, we are talking about the effect of what happens if you invoke your Miranda rights. Nothing too complicated to talk about. This will be a fairly short episode, but let's talk about this effect. Well, if a subject properly invokes the Miranda rights, all questioning by the police must cease immediately. That's the main effect. If the right is invoked, however, the police may resume questioning again underneath certain situations. If the right is invoked if the right to remain silent is invoked, well then the officers may resume questioning first, if the officer honors the initial request, second, if significant time has passed, and third, if the resumed questioning is about a different crime. We talked about this standard in a previous episode, and that is the Mosley standard. If the right invoked is the right to counsel, however, the police must cease questioning entirely, and they cannot resume questioning until either the counsel has arrived or the subject initiates additional questioning themselves. And this rule is outlined in Edwards versus Arizona. Okay, so we've got a couple of cases here, only two cases actually, to describe how this rule is going to work and how states kind of approach this to begin with. In Globe versus State, after a subject invokes their Miranda rights, this invocation must be scrupulously honored. And so how do you know if something is scrupulously honored? Well, the courts are supposed to consider whether or not the officer ceased questioning immediately, whether a significant time has passed before returning to questioning, whether Miranda warnings were provided at the initial and the reinstated questioning, whether the questioning took place in another location, and whether the reinstated questioning concerns another crime. Now, what this case says, Globe versus State, it says that no factor is dispositive, which means these are not elements. These are factors. The court can consider everything. And you are to consider all of these factors based off the totality of the circumstances. To outline this rule, Globe versus State actually looked at Mosley to get most of those factors, and then also looked at some of their own state law, which in that case was Henry versus State. And that's why they determined that the rule is what it is. So in the case of Globe versus State, the officers did everything right, except the one thing that they didn't do is that the reinstated questioning was about the same crime instead of a different crime. But the officers ceased questioning immediately. There was a significant time before they resumed questioning. Miranda warnings were provided frequently and often and at the right times. And the questioning took place in a different location. The only thing that was wrong here is that it was about the same crime instead of a different crime. So because we've hit 4 out of those 5 factors, the court here in Globe versus State says that the officers did properly resume questioning, and for that reason, they scrupulously honored Globe's initial invocation, and then later, when he went on to confess, that evidence may be used against him at trial. One more case, Benjamin versus State. What's our rule here? Well, when a subject invokes the right to counsel, the previous one was a right to silence, but this one now is the right to counsel. Questioning must cease until counsel appears, or the subject knowingly, intentionally, and voluntarily waives their rights and initiates that conversation again with the officer. Following the Innis rule, Innis was the case that we talked about a while ago, about interrogation and knowing if a person is being interrogated. An interrogation in this case took place. Benjamin invoked his rights, and the officer turned to the mother. So, okay, let me give you some details about this case before I get into this analysis. Benjamin was a youth. I think he was 14 years old. Him and his mother ended up being taken into questioning. Particularly, Benjamin was the youth was the one who is being questioned. Mother was there as support, and the officers told him, hey, you have these rights. Benjamin immediately said, I want my lawyer. I want my juvenile lawyer. And the officer said, I don't know if we could get you your juvenile lawyer because the crime that you committed was murder, which is a capital offense, which means I don't know if you're going to be, if a juvenile lawyer is going to work in this situation. The officer said, if you tell us what's going on, you might not need to stay the night here, even though it's pretty certain that that Benjamin was going to have to stay the night. Benjamin didn't want to stay the night, and his mother said, we can't afford a lawyer, so you might as well confess. The officers talked to the mom, told the mom what they needed for a waiver to occur, and the officer stepped out. Mom clearly pressured her son into waiving his rights. The son did waive his rights, and then the officers went ahead and obtained a confession. So, following the Innis rule, this was an interrogation, and Benjamin invoked his rights. When Benjamin invoked his rights, they turned to the mother, who wanted Benjamin to speak, and they explained on what needed to be done in order for Benjamin to actually speak. The mother followed the instructions and induced Benjamin to speak. Benjamin was young, he was immature, his main concern was not about the capital offense, but whether or not he needed to stay in jail overnight. And so with this concern, the officers were pretty easy. It was pretty easy for the officers to influence and lie to Benjamin in a manner that would encourage his speech. Who Benjamin believed that speaking would actually mean that he got to go home that evening. Based off of these things, Benjamin did not properly waive his right to counsel, and for this reason, the officers did not scrupulously honor that request. The defendant in this case, though, does argue that it wouldn't have been any different if the officers had just abruptly stopped asking right away. If the officers stopped asking right away, well, and then Benjamin would have said, oh, I'm going to stay here overnight anyways. I might as well just speak. So the defendant knew his rights because the defendant was very aware that he could get counsel. Initially, right away, he had requested his counsel. He had experience with the judicial system. And for these reasons, his waiver could have been valid. One other thing to note related to this material, if the officers wish to reinstate conversation after the subject has invoked their right to counsel, they can do so after the subject has left custody and if the officers wait for 14 days. Why 14 days? Gotta draw the line somewhere. And that's just the line that the courts ended up drawing. That rule is outlined in Maryland versus Schatzer. But that's the effect of invoking Miranda rights. What happens? And essentially it's when can the officers resume questioning. If they invoke the right to silence, you need to make sure it's scrupulously honored. And we talked about the factors for scrupulously honoring that request. If it's about the right to counsel, a waiver occurs. If the rights are invoked, well, then that needs to be scrupulously honored unless the defendant ends up reinstating that conversation with the police, or if the police release the defendant from custody and then pick him up again after a couple of weeks. All right, that's everything from this material. Have a good one. Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Law Schoolers. Before I let you go, there are 4 things I want to say. The first thing is if you enjoyed these episodes and if you enjoyed the website, I would invite you to go and join Law Schoolers Pro. And you can do that by going to lawschoolers.com/join. It's a way for you to support us, but there's also a lot of features there that I think you will enjoy. Second thing is that nearly all of our episodes are unedited. The only ones that aren't are pre-law materials, and the reason for that is so you can actually see the legal material in its raw form as I'm learning it, as well. The third thing is that the information contained in these episodes are specifically only for educational purposes. They're not to be used as legal advice. And with that, the fourth thing is if it is used as legal advice, we are not liable. That is, law scholars is not liable for any legal outcomes. Thank you again for enjoying the show. Have a good one.